A locked door is a simple mechanism. It's designed to keep danger out. But on March 25, 1911, on the 8th floor of a modern New York City skyscraper, the locks weren't for keeping people out. They were for keeping the workers in. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory called it a security measure to prevent theft. The young immigrant girls who toiled inside knew it for what it was, a cage. And when the first wisp of smoke curled up from a scrap bin, that simple, brutal policy would turn their workplace into a towering tomb, forcing hundreds to make a choice no one should ever have to make. This was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a sweatshop, though no one called it that to the owners' faces. And on this particular Saturday, March 25th, the nearly 500 workers inside were just hours away from freedom. The end of a 6-day work week was in sight. Most of them were girls, some as young as 14. Immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe, they were the engine of the city's booming garment industry, hunched over their machines, stitching the fashionable shirt-waist blouses that were all the rage. The air on the 8th floor was thick, heavy with the smell of machine oil and hot fabric. But more than that, it was filled with lint. Fine, fluffy particles of cotton and linen hung in the air like a perpetual haze, coating every surface and piling up in drifts under the cutting tables. For the owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, these scraps were just the cost of doing business. For the girls, they were a constant nuisance, something to be brushed off their clothes and wiped from their faces. No one saw them for what they truly were, kindling. The factory floor was a labyrinth designed for profit, not people. Long tables and sewing machines were packed so tightly together that the aisles were barely wide enough for a single person. To move from one end of the room to the other was to navigate a crowded obstacle course. Hanging above it all, strung on wires that crisscrossed the ceiling, were delicate tissue paper patterns for the next line of blouses, fluttering like ghosts in the drafts from the windows. It was almost 4:45 p.m. Quitting time. A ripple of anticipation passed through the room. Girls began to tidy their stations, their movements quickening with the thought of collecting their pay and stepping out into the crisp spring air. They dreamed of a Sunday stroll, of sending a few precious dollars back home to their families, of a life beyond the endless drone of the factory. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory wasn't just a workplace. It was a prison disguised as one. The owners, paranoid about theft and unauthorized breaks, had a policy. A simple, brutal policy. The main exit, the one leading to the Washington Place stairway, was kept locked from the outside during work hours. To leave, the girls had to file past a single open door on the Green Street side, where a watchman would inspect their handbags one by one. It was a humiliating, time-consuming ritual designed to treat every one of them as a potential thief. The managers claimed it was for their own good. But the girls knew better. They knew it was about control. They were caged. No one knows for sure how it started. A spar from machine, perhaps. Or a still glowing cigarette, but tossed carelessly into one of the massive scrap bins beneath a cutting table. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. A wisp of smoke, thin and gray, curled up from a bin near the Green Street side of the 8th floor. At first, no one noticed. The hum of the machines and the focus on finishing the day's work was all-consuming. Then, a small flicker of orange. A cutter saw it and shouted. He grabbed one of the red water buckets that were legally required to be there. But the small splash of water was useless. It was like trying to put out a bonfire with a teacup. The flame, fed by a mountain of dry fabric scraps, didn't just grow. It erupted. It lunged upwards, instantly igniting the tissue paper patterns hanging from the ceiling. A web of fire raced across the room, raining down embers on the heads of the terrified girls and onto the bolts of fabric below. Within seconds, what was a small fire became a roaring, ravenous monster. Panic set in. The singular thought of nearly 200 people on that floor was out. Screams replaced the sound of sewing machines. They surged away from the flames, a wave of humanity rushing towards the exits they had used every single day. Some ran towards the Green Street side, where they knew the foreman would eventually unlock the door for inspection. Others, closer to the Washington Place exit, instinctively ran for the door that led directly to the street. They reached it, a frantic mob, pushing and shoving. A young woman at the front grabbed the handle and twisted. Nothing. She threw her shoulder against the heavy wooden door. It didn't budge. More girls piled in behind her, their collective weight slamming against it. But the lock was strong. The door was barred. A terrible, chilling realization washed over them, a cold dread even more terrifying than the heat at their backs. The door wouldn't open. They were trapped. The fire was devouring the room behind them, and the way out was sealed shut. On the other side of the 8th floor, a similar scene of chaos unfolded at the Green Street exit. This was the one door they were meant to use, the one that led to the freight elevators and a second staircase. But the fire had erupted closest to this side. Flames now formed a roaring curtain between the bulk of the workers and their only sanctioned escape route. A few who were nearby managed to stumble through the smoke and heat, but for most, it was already cut off. The exit was an illusion. That left two other possibilities: the elevators and a single, spindly fire escape at the rear of the building. Two elevator operators, Joseph Zito and Joseph Gasper, were just preparing for their final runs of the day when the first terrified screams reached them. A bell rang frantically from the 8th floor. Mortallero sent his car up. When the doors opened, he wasn't met with a line of girls waiting for their pay. He was met with a wall of fire and smoke. Screaming figures poured into his car, clawing their way inside, piling on top of one another. He crammed as many as he could and began a desperate descent, the heat from the fire above already beginning to warp the metal tracks. He made one trip, then a second. Each time he returned, the scene was worse. The smoke was a solid black wall, and the screams were thick with desperation. On his third trip up, the heat was so intense he could barely breathe. As he reached the 8th floor, he saw a crowd of girls waiting, their faces illuminated by the inferno behind them. They surged forward, but before they could reach the car, the fire billowed out, and he could see their hair and clothes begin to smolder. The weight of people jumping onto the roof of his elevator car caused it to buckle. He had no choice but to go down, leaving them behind. On the way, the bodies of those who had jumped into the elevator shaft began to thud against the top of his car. It was his last trip. The fire had claimed the elevators. Meanwhile, on the 9th floor, the warning came not from a shout or a bell, but from the smoke and flames licking up from the floorboards below. They were even more trapped than the girls on the 8th. The fire was beneath them. Panic was instantaneous. Some ran for the elevators, only to find them gone. Others discovered their own floor's doors to the stairways were also locked. The owner's obsession with control extended throughout their entire operation. A crowd of workers discovered the lone fire escape. It seemed like a miracle, a narrow, iron ladder to salvation. They poured out the windows onto the small platform. But the fire escape was a cruel joke. It was built to the absolute minimum legal standard, a flimsy ribbon of metal never designed to hold the weight of dozens of panicked people. It terminated not on the ground, but in a skylight 2 stories above a dark, enclosed courtyard. It was an escape to nowhere. As more and more terrified workers crowded onto it, the iron groaned under the strain. The heat from the fire was making the metal soft, causing it to sag and twist. Then, with a horrific, metallic shriek, the bolts tore from the brickwork. The entire structure, laden with dozens of screaming people, peeled away from the building and crashed into the courtyard below. The one sliver of hope had become a mass grave. The fire, feeding on a building full of combustibles, moved with impossible speed. In less than 5 minutes, it had consumed the 8th floor and was raging across the 9th. The heat was so intense it shattered the windows, sending shards of glass raining down onto the street below. And it was then that the true horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire revealed itself to the city of New York. Down on the street, crowds had begun to gather, drawn by the smoke and the clang of the first horse-drawn fire engines. They looked up, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. The upper floors of the fireproof Asch Building were a furnace, belching black smoke and bright orange flames. And then they saw them, silhouettes in the windows. The first girl appeared on a ledge on the 9th floor. Her dress was smoking. For a moment, she stood there, 100 feet above the pavement, caught between two impossible choices, the inferno at her back or the empty air in front of her. The crowd below screamed, "Don't jump." Firefighters were arriving, but their ladders, the tallest in the city, reached only to the 6th floor. The life nets they held out looked like postage stamps. She jumped. For a sickening second, she was suspended in the air, her skirt billowing around her like a parachute that wouldn't open. Then she fell, a silent, speeding shape, until she hit the net. The force of her impact ripped the net from the hands of the firefighters holding it. She, and the next two girls who jumped right after her, hit the concrete with a sound that witnesses would say haunted them for the rest of their lives. The nets were useless, and still they came, one after another, sometimes in pairs holding hands. An entire wave of young women, their lives reduced to a final, terrible decision made in a split second. They were not choosing to die. They were choosing how. It was an escape from the fire. The 8th floor had been a prison. The 9th floor, a tomb. And the windows were the only doors left that would open. In just 8 minutes, the promise of a Saturday evening had turned into hell on earth. The fire itself was extinguished in less than half an hour. By the time firefighters could finally get water to the upper floors, there was little left to burn. The inferno had consumed everything flammable with terrifying efficiency, leaving behind a skeletal ruin of blackened tables and twisted metal sewing machines. But the true, grim work had only just begun. Firefighters and police officers who ascended the still-hot stairways were met with a scene from Dante's Inferno. The 8th floor, where the locked Washington Place door stood, was the most horrific. Here, dozens of bodies were piled up against the door, their hands charred from trying to force it open. They had died in a desperate, futile heap, so close to escape. Others were found melted to their sewing machines, overcome by smoke before they could even rise. On the 9th floor, the scene was similar. Charred remains were clustered around the windows and the useless fire escape. In the elevator shafts, they found the bodies of those who had made the hopeless leap, a tangled mass of humanity. Rescuers walked through the debris, past rows of what looked like sleeping figures, only to realize they were the dead, covered in a thin layer of ash and soot. They worked in silence, their faces grim masks, carrying the bodies down one by one. The street below became a makeshift morgue, where families would soon begin the agonizing task of identifying their loved ones. In total, 146 souls were lost. 123 women and 23 men. Most were teenagers. The youngest were just 14 years old. The city was plunged into a state of shock, then grief, then a deep and burning anger. How could this happen? In a modern, fireproof building, in the heart of the most advanced city in the world? The newspapers, filled with haunting sketches of the falling girls and heart-wrenching accounts from survivors, all screamed the same question. Who was to blame? The answer for most of New York was simple: Max Blank and Isaac Harris, the Shirtwaist Kings. Within days, the two owners were indicted on charges of manslaughter. The prosecution's case seemed open and shut. Their star witness was Kate Alterman, a survivor from the 8th floor who testified that she had tried the Washington Place door every single day for months, and it was always locked. On the day of the fire, she saw a manager's sister, Mary Alter, desperately trying to open it, to no avail. The prosecution's argument was clear. The locked door had turned a survivable fire into a massacre. It was a direct violation of safety laws, which stipulated that factory doors must swing outwards and remain unlocked from the inside during business hours. The trial began, and the city was captivated. Day after day, young, traumatized survivors took the stand, recounting their horrific experiences through tears. They spoke of the locked doors, the narrow aisles, the useless fire escape, and the callous disregard for their safety. They described a workplace where they were treated not as people, but as cogs in a machine to be locked in until the final bell rang. But Blank and Harris had hired one of the best defense attorneys in the city, Max Stoyer. And Stoyer was a master of legal maneuvering and courtroom theatrics. He knew he couldn't dispute the horror of the fire. Instead, he would attack the very foundation of the prosecution's case, the locked door. His strategy was brutal and effective. He subjected the young, immigrant survivors to withering cross-examinations. These girls, many of whom spoke little English and had just endured unimaginable trauma, were made to repeat their stories over and over. Stoyer picked at tiny inconsistencies in their accounts. Did she see the flames first or smell the smoke? Was the manager standing to the left of the door or the right? He confused them, twisted their words, and suggested that in the panic of the fire, they couldn't possibly remember accurately what had happened. He painted them as unreliable, hysterical witnesses. His masterstroke came when he put his own witnesses on the stand. He produced a series of employees, including managers, and even one of the owner's relatives who had been there, who all swore under oath to the same story. They claimed that while the door was sometimes locked, a key was always kept in the lock. On the day of the fire, they testified the key was there. The manager, they argued, must have been trying to turn the key in the lock, but in his panic he was turning it the wrong way. It was a lie, but a plausible one. The prosecution couldn't definitively prove otherwise. All of their key witnesses had been through hell. Could their memory be trusted beyond a reasonable doubt? Stoyer had planted that seed of doubt in the jury's mind. In his closing arguments, Stoyer didn't defend the owner's practices. Instead, he delivered a brilliant, calculated speech, asking the jury to set aside their emotions. He reminded them that this was a court of law, not public opinion. The question wasn't whether Blank and Harris were good employers. The question was whether the prosecution had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they were personally responsible for locking that specific door on that specific day, leading directly to the death of a specific worker named in the indictment. The jury, a panel of 12 men from the same business class as the owners, deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict came back, not guilty. A gasp, followed by a wave of outrage, swept through the courtroom. The Shirtwaist Kings walked free. They would later settle civil suits, paying just $75 per life lost. For the families of the 146 victims, for the city of New York, it was a profound injustice. The trial by jury had failed. But another trial, a trial by fire, had already begun, and its verdict would be written not in a courtroom, but in the law books of the nation. The acquittal of Blank and Harris was a slap in the face to a grieving city. It felt like the system had valued profit over people, that the lives of 146 immigrant girls were worth less than the legal cunning of a high-priced lawyer. The outrage was palpable. On April 5th, a massive funeral procession, organized by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, took place in the pouring rain. Over 100,000 people marched in silence down Fifth Avenue, while another 400,000 citizens lined the streets to watch and pay their respects. It was a silent, sorrowful, and deeply angry protest. The message was clear: this could not and would not happen again. The fire had exposed a rot at the core of industrial America. For years, activists, union leaders, and social reformers have been shouting about the dangerous conditions in factories and sweatshops, but their cries were largely ignored by politicians and the public. Now, no one could look away. The image of the girls jumping from the windows was seared into the nation's conscience. The fire became a rallying cry, a horrifyingly vivid symbol of corporate greed and government neglect. In the wake of the public outcry, New York's political machine, the infamous Tammany Hall, saw that the tide was turning. To ignore the public's fury was political suicide. They appointed a state commission to investigate factory conditions, not just in New York City, but across the state. It was called the Factory Investigating Commission. At its head were two ambitious young politicians, Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith and State Senator Robert F. Wagner. They, along with a determined social worker named Frances Perkins, who had witnessed the fire firsthand from the street below, embarked on an unprecedented mission. For the next 2 years, they toured the state, descending into the grimy depths of its factories, canneries, and tenements. What they found was a system rife with the same dangers that had doomed the Triangle workers. They found fire traps with barred windows and locked doors. They found factories with no sprinklers, filthy sanitation, and children as young as 5 working long hours. They interviewed countless workers who were too afraid to speak out for fear of losing their meager jobs. Frances Perkins would later recall, "The Triangle Fire was the day the New Deal began." Armed with first-hand evidence and the unshakable moral authority born from the ashes of the Asch Building, the commission began its work. Between 1911 and 1914, guided by the tireless efforts of Smith, Wagner, and Perkins, the New York State Legislature passed an astonishing 38 new laws. These weren't minor tweaks. They were a revolutionary overhaul of labor and safety regulations. They became known as the laws written in ash. New laws mandated automatic sprinkler systems in high-rise buildings. They required that all factory doors swing outward and remain unlocked during work hours. Fire drills became mandatory. The number of people allowed in a given workspace was limited based on square footage and the number of exits. They established better building access and fireproofing standards. The flimsy, useless fire escape that had collapsed at the Triangle factory was outlawed, replaced by strict requirements for sturdy, safe emergency exits. But it didn't stop there. The Commission's work expanded beyond just fire safety. They pushed through legislation creating the first state-level Department of Labor to enforce these new rules. They passed laws to improve factory sanitation, create ventilation requirements, and provide for workers' compensation. They established limits on working hours for women and, most importantly, passed sweeping prohibitions on child labor. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had done what years of protests and strikes could not. It forced society to recognize that a worker was not just a component of a machine, but a human being with a right to a safe workplace. The 146 victims had not died in vain. Their sacrifice became the cornerstone upon which modern American workplace safety was built. The legacy of that terrible Saturday afternoon echoes to this day. Every time you see a sprinkler head in a ceiling, an outward opening exit door with a panic bar, or a clearly marked fire escape, you're seeing a direct result of the lessons learned from the Triangle Fire. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, established decades later, has its conceptual roots in the work of the Factory Investigating Commission. The careers of its key members were forged in that fire. Al Smith would become a popular governor of New York, Robert Wagner a U.S. Senator who would author the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, and Frances Perkins would become the first female cabinet member in U.S. history, serving as Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt and helping to architect the New Deal. The Asch Building still stands, now known as the Brown Building and part of New York University. It is a National Historic Landmark. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, a ceremony is held. The names of the 146 victims are read aloud, and a fire truck raises its ladder to the 6th floor, a solemn reminder of how tragically short the best equipment of the day fell. The story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is more than a horror story or a historical disaster. It is a testament to the fact that progress is often born from tragedy, and that the fight for safety and dignity is a battle that must be fought and won again and again. The doors were locked, but the fire they ignited opened the door to a safer future for millions.